I'm Tina English, the founder and director of Embracing Age, and today we've got Jude, who's kindly volunteered to be interviewed by us. Jude has been volunteering with us for about 4 years, visiting one of the local care homes, spending time with the residents. And Jude was one of the first volunteers who's been able to go back into the care homes since lockdown. So Jude, thank you for joining us today. Tell us a little bit about what your visits were like before lockdown.
Well, I would go into the care home I visit, generally the same care home, generally once a week, and I would spend time with the residents, generally in the residents' lounge. Occasionally I speak to people one-to-one who perhaps don't want to come into the residents' lounge, but I spend time chatting, just talking generally. Sometimes I play music, we do a bit of singing, bit of dancing, bit of hand movement, feet tapping, getting the residents moving, and that's what I was doing.
Brilliant. And I know that the care home loved having you there because the manager was very keen for you to come back as soon as possible after all the lockdown restrictions were lifted. So I'm sure you've been making a real difference in the lives of the residents there. Well, I know you have, because that's what the manager tells us. Can you give us a bit of an idea of what's been happening since lockdown? Have you managed to spend time or stay connected with the care home during lockdown?
I haven't stayed connected with any particular individual resident in the care home, but I have stayed in contact a little bit by email or by just visiting. Sometimes I take flowers or a plant or something. And also we, as Embracing Age, donated care packages for the staff, which we did last May. I think it's almost a year ago, as a surprise, which they really appreciated.
Yeah, wonderful. So you went back for your first visit about a week ago, 2 weeks ago. What was it like?
Well, firstly, obviously, you have to be tested before you go into a care home. And also, we have to wear, PPE to an extent, a face mask and gloves to be able to go in, which does change the experience because it's much harder for people to hear you speaking through a mask. And yes, so that does sort of change things. But as far as the residents are concerned, I think the hardest thing was that although often residents living with dementia don't know who I am, there is a sort of facial recognition. And with certain of the residents, they were looking at me like I was a complete stranger, which I hadn't experienced before. So I think it's a matter of rebuilding connections.
Yeah, that's quite hard, isn't it? When people you've had connections with in the past, suddenly it feels like that connection is lost.
Yes, you can see it very vividly in their face that they really didn't know who I was, because over a year in a life of living with dementia is a very long time. A person living with dementia is a very long time.
Yeah, and I know from my own experience of visiting a lady with dementia in a care home that even though they don't recognise she, over 3 years, she never knew my name at all, but she always knew that I was somebody who brought her happiness and joy, and there was a sense of safety. That even though she couldn't remember who I was, she remembered that sense that I left her with. And so you used to have that with residents.
Definitely, and I know there's been research done on that if you get very angry with somebody living with dementia, they associate you with that feeling of somebody being angry with them. Hopefully I left them feeling some joy. So I certainly feel joy when I came away. So yes, hopefully that was the case.
And do you feel like that memory of the feelings that you left them with previously were still there, or you've got to start from scratch and build that again?
I think with some people I will have to start from scratch because they definitely didn't know who I was, recognise me. But there are other residents. There's a lady who's not living with dementia who did remember me, and there were certainly some of the residents who obviously had some sort of cognitive recognition of me because they still seemed the same with me. Although sadly, the thing you do notice is deterioration in a lot of people where, perhaps, they lost a lot more body weight, or perhaps they're not moving as much. And I think that's something that I particularly noticed.
Yeah. So how did it feel to see everyone again?
Oh, I was delighted to be back. Yes, it was difficult because obviously some residents have passed away, not through COVID, but for other reasons. And obviously when people don't sort of recognise you, it's not quite the same feeling when you go in. But as I say, I think it's just a case of rebuilding connections.
Yeah. And did any of the residents talk to you about their lockdown experience?
Yes, there's a lady who is not living with dementia who actually could understand that when her relatives were allowed to come and see her, that she could understand why they had to be behind a screen and understand that. But people living with dementia, I'm sure, would have found that very, very confusing and quite frightening, because obviously there's been no touch allowed. So, you know, even holding somebody's hand is a very important thing for people living with dementia to have that experience. It's, I believe, very important for their mental health.
Mm. And were you able to hold hands and things like that when you went back this time?
I haven't as yet. No. I haven't been told not to, but I've made you know, I would obviously check before I took that step with the care home staff.
And that must be quite hard for you because you're quite a tactile
I'm a very tactile person.
You? So
yeah, I always hold people's hands when I'm talking to them.
Yeah.
You know. And there's a lady living with dementia, and I do that, you know, round the garden, like a teddy bear, one pop one. And of course I can't do that with her. She always laughs, she finds it funny.
Oh. So it's an adjustment for the residents as well, to when they're used to experiencing that sort of touch, to not have that. Must be so difficult.
It must be very difficult. And I know quite a lot of the volunteers do hand massages or manicures or something like that. Well, obviously that's not something that we're doing at the moment. No.
Do you have any advice for anyone preparing for their first visit back to a care home to visit a friend or relative?
I think you have to be aware that the person you're visiting, there may have been some deterioration in some way. You know, either cognitively or physically, and I was prepared for it, but I still was rather saddened by it. So I think that's something you have to think about.
Yeah. And what would you say to someone who's thinking about becoming a volunteer visiting care home residents?
Well, I would say absolutely do it, because I absolutely love it. But I think the thing is that, yes, I mean, Embracing Age give you very good training. There is always somebody on the end of the phone if you encounter something that you're not used to. So that's, and also there is ongoing training that you can do. So although you go in, you're not alone. You've always got somebody to talk to, and it is very rewarding. I volunteered because I was thinking, oh, I'd like to give something back to the community, but I also get a lot back. So I really enjoy it.
What do you get back? You're saying you get a lot back. What sort of things
Well,
do you get
I
back?
find it uplifting. I find the stories, even somebody with quite severe dementia usually has fantastic stories all about their childhood or their upbringing or the war years, and, you know, things like, I've been told things like preserving eggs in isinglass, which is made of fish scales. I didn't know about that. You know, in the war, or runner beans sliced in salt and things like that. So there's some lovely stories, and even though you can't always talk on a contemporary level about news or something like that, you can always find connections. It might be through music. Often people living with dementia, they can't speak, but they can sing. Or we'll do a quiz, and somebody whose language, command of language, is no longer there will suddenly give you an answer to a question. Some quite funny ones.
You can tell us about those another time then. Jude, thank you so much for sharing your experiences with us today. If anyone's interested in volunteering, we do have some training coming up, and there's always more in the future as well. You can get in contact with us via our website.